The dead are talking to Dominic, meaning his grandfather. And it is a cautionary tale because he sees what a miserable life the grandfather had and how miserable and cruel he was to others. Dominic, he had better not turn into the grandfather or he's going to have the fate of the grandfather.
Dear Family is a podcast hosted by Rachel Steinman, a writer, an educator, and a mental health advocate. And Rachel gets us up close and personal, so we feel a strong connection, familiarity, and comfort with her guests. So settle in and join us as we search for true healing and journey with Rachel and her most interesting guests.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing as best as can be expected during these very unusual times. And hopefully you're getting outside and getting some fresh air and feeling the sunshine. I am so excited about this week's episode. Honestly, you have got to listen to this episode just to hear Wally Lamb give me one of the best compliments I've ever received and hear me squeal with true excitement. I was so incredibly thrilled to have a one-on-one conversation with the master. Make sure to stay tuned. And thank you so much for listening and subscribing, whether it's on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or Spotify or Google Podcasts. It means a lot to me. And hey, those 5-star reviews, they really do help me grow. By the way, follow me at Right Now Rachel, and that's right with a W, on all the social media platforms. Without further ado, stay tuned. Wally Lamb is the author of not just one or two, but 6 New York Times bestselling novels, and they speak to generations of readers who recognize their own struggles within his characters. And he's also been twice selected for Oprah's book club with She's Come Undone and I Know This Much Is True, a current HBO limited series starring Mark Ruffalo as identical twin brothers, one with paranoid schizophrenia. The human struggle and the power of story to heal, well, that inspires Wally, a former high school and college English teacher. The work he's done teaching writing to women prisoners in Connecticut and editing 2 volumes of their essays most embodies the idea of the healing power of storytelling. Wally was born to a working-class family in Norwich, Connecticut. He began writing in 1981, the year he became a father, and he credits his ability to write in female voices with having grown up with older sisters in a neighborhood largely populated by girls. Wally and his wife Christine, they live in northeastern Connecticut and in New York City, and are the parents of 3 sons and 3 grandkids. Wally's characters are imperfect people seeking to become better people, stories that move beyond the boundaries and limitations of his own experience to better understand the lives of others. You can't help but see yourself in his stories and to be moved. I am so incredibly honored and thrilled to welcome the one and only Wally Lamb. Wally, first of all, I just want to thank our mutual friend, Jamie Patrikoff. He introduced me to Kayla and to Angela and put us in touch, and so I'm very grateful. So thanks, Jamie. I know that you both are producers on the HBO Limited series, which is so exciting. I just have to let you know, back when I Know This Much Is True came out, I read it and adored it and was so honored and happy to get the screeners, and I binged them literally in a day. I watched all of them.
Oh my goodness, I'm glad you survived.
Oh my God, I was emotional. And I also listened to the audio version of the book simultaneously. So it was such a great refresher. That was really so cool.
I'm curious, which audio did you listen to? Was it George Goodell or Ken Howard, who did another version of it?
I don't know. I got it off Audible, and it was the abridged version.
That's the less successful.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because
it was excellent. So
good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yes. So is the other version the unabridged?
I think George Goodell's interpretation understands paranoid schizophrenia a little bit more than the other reader. I couldn't listen to the other version for very long because Thomas didn't sound like somebody who was suffering from that particular disease. He sounded like somebody who had mental retardation or something, which is a miscue.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay, well, if I can find the time, I'd love to listen to the other one. So, Wally, this is a podcast called Dear Family because mental health issues affect our entire family, but it's also to celebrate our family. I am wondering if you can just briefly tell us a little bit about yourself and your family.
Sure. I am married to one of my best friends in high school, my wife, Christine, and we went off to college and she had a first marriage and I was waiting patiently. And we were married in 1978. We have 3 kids. The first 2 live in the New Orleans area and are both educators. And then number 3 is our non-biological son. He was our nephew when we adopted him from drug-addicted parents. We have 3 children. We have 3 grandchildren by our son, Jared. I came from a very large Italian family on my mother's side. My mother was one of 11 kids. The mental illness part of it comes from my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who I didn't know. I think he died when I was about 3 years old. In his later years, he had been a shoemaker for Sicilian immigrants in Norwich, Connecticut. He was kind of like the mayor. Men would come with their pregnant wives and have them walk up and down the street, and he would tell them, whether they were going to have a boy or a girl, that kind of thing. But anyway, sadly, in his later years, he developed what we later found out through an autopsy was a brain tumor, but it had made him violent. He made an attempt to kill my grandmother and was locked away in the state hospital for the mentally ill in the forensic unit. For the last years of his life, he lived behind bars. Like I said, I never knew him, and I didn't realize at the time when I was writing, I know this much is true, that I was doing this. But subsequently, when the book was finished, I realized that I was creating a grandfather in the Italian section in the vacuum of all I didn't know about my actual grandfather.
That is so interesting. My maternal grandfather also suffered from mental illness and sadly ended up jumping to his death. I love the idea of Connie giving Dominic the manuscript because it rang so personally to me because I discovered my grandfather's unfinished manuscript 24 years after he jumped. So I know your characters are so relatable, but that was especially relatable. And we'll get into that in a second. Yeah. I'm assuming HBO and everyone is so happy that I know this much is true. And I'm going to call it true. Was filmed last year before COVID. How are you doing with sheltering at home?
I'm doing okay. They were editing the final episodes of the series back in March. Derek Cianfrance was editing as quickly as he could and afraid that the building where he was editing was going to close down. And he wasn't sure if he could do this complicated editing from home with telephone calls going back and forth to some of his other editors. He invited my wife and me to the city to look at the 6 episodes as finished as they were at that point. And that was in March. That was, I think, the last couple of weeks in March. We went into New York and went to a screening building and saw episodes 1, 2, and 3. And then the plan that had been laid out for us, we were going to return the following Monday and watch episodes 4, 5, and 6. And we did. At that point, there was some stirrings about, what was happening with the virus spread and so forth. My wife has a mother who needs attention and, she's elderly. And so my wife went home and I decided, I'm writing a new novel now. I decided, well, we have a little apartment in the city. And I said, I'm just going to stay here and do some quiet work and so forth. And I'll see you at the end of the week. So I was writing in the morning, and then in the afternoon, I would get on the subway or go to a movie and so forth. And every day that I was there, I saw more and more people wearing masks. And I was not particularly plugged into the news at that point. I decided to get my butt back to Connecticut. I'm just very fortunate that I didn't contract the virus because I think it was about the following week when the numbers started zooming.
Oh, I'm so grateful that you didn't. Thank goodness.
I'm also fortunate that my life hasn't been upended because I'm a writer, so I socially isolate anyway during my work time. I've been able to be pretty productive. Actually, I think I'm more productive than before. There there was all this quarantining. I'm grateful for that.
Good. And it's just that you're probably unable to see your kids in New Orleans. But yeah, thankfully we've got technology like this.
More my wife but I have a gig where I do a literacy lesson with our 5-year-old grandson once a week, and she takes the other days. So we actually get to see him quite a bit. And then his 2-year-old sister comes by the camera, and she likes to get attention for herself, and she's adorable. And then occasionally we get to see the baby, who's kind of master crawling at this point. We see them, but seeing him in 2 dimensions is not the same as seeing them.
No, it's not. And aren't 5-year-olds so fun? I taught kindergarten for many years, so I just love that age. I will never forget when Oprah picked your book for her book club, because I'm a huge Oprah fan. Love her so much. I think she single-handedly, along with J.K. Rowling, brought reading novels back to the American, maybe to the world, to the public. Yeah. So what was it like? Do you remember getting that call that she was going to pick She's Come Undone?
I do indeed remember. It was a very significant day for me, and not necessarily a 100% happy day. What had happened, I was teaching high school at the time, and the day before, there had been a terrible tragedy. A student of mine who was in theater, she's kind of like a goth kid, but very, very likable. And she was a creative writer. And she was in a play at the school. They were rehearsing, and she had recruited her younger brother, who was, I think, 11, to do a juvenile part in the play that they were preparing. The rehearsal was over, and the two of them were crossing the street to their car, and they were hit and killed by a drunk driver. The family is Jewish, so the funeral was within 24 hours after that. And we were all still sort of reeling, hugging each other, all that day in school and so forth. After I left the synagogue and drove home, it was winter time, I think it was January, and I still had my coat on. I walked in the door, and there was a phone call, and it was Oprah. Now this was, the year was 1997. The novel had been published in 1992, and it had a nice, quiet little life, but it was 5 years old at that point. I said to her, Oprah, I know I'm going to be thrilled, but I'm still sort of trying to take in what has happened with one of my students and her brother. So she was very understanding, and it was, I'm telling you, Rachel, it was sort of like the best and the worst of life happening simultaneously. It was very confusing for me. She did say, before the phone call ended, she said, or she handed the phone to her, one of her producers. And the producer said to me, we are so sorry about this, but you need to get a hold of your publisher. This was a Friday after hours. And she said, you need to get to your publisher this weekend, because we're going to announce the book club choice in 2 weeks. They have to start printing copies of the book this weekend. I said, well, I don't have anybody's home numbers or anything. One thing happened after another, and I was able to connect to somebody at about 10 o'clock that night. Indeed, they showed up at the office on a Saturday morning and ordered pulp and started planning for this, massive publication.
Wow. And then 2 years later, she picks, or was it even 1 year later, she picked, I know this much is true. Unbelievable.
Yeah, when the first book was finished in 1992, I started the second book. This was all before the Oprah thing. I had been writing that one for about 6 years, I think. And that's, I know this much is true. It was published in the beginning of the summer of 1998. And Oprah called again. There's a funny story attached to that because I was in New York doing publicity, and I was in my hotel room talking to I think it was the Book of the Month editor or something. And Oprah calls, and I knew from the first experience that, this had to be shrouded in secrecy. So I picked up the phone, and she said it was Oprah. And she said, guess what? You're going to be our summer pick for, summer of 1998. And she's like, woohoo, and all that kind of stuff. And I said, and I knew I wasn't supposed to give it away. So I said, well, okay, thank you so much, ma'am. Could you call me back in about 10 minutes? And she said, yeah, I'll call you back in 15. So I hung up the phone. I finished the interview. I walked the reporter out to the elevators, and then I went dashing back to my hotel room, only to find out that I had locked myself out of the room. And I had to run down many flights of stairs and get another key. I got back in the room and no call, for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 20.
And you're
about
wondering, like, did I
later,
dream that?
Yeah, I decided I was just not going to tell my editor that this call had happened if she never called back. But of course she did, and the rest was history.
Wow. Well, those were very memorable moments for you, for sure. In She's Come Undone, you write about Dolores, who attempts suicide and is institutionalized before she's released. And in True, you write about Thomas, who's a paranoid schizophrenic, and he's institutionalized. Does your interest in mental illness come from your grandfather, do you think? Or is this also from working in the prisons, which we'll talk about in a minute?
No, actually, it comes from, to some extent, my grandfather's story, but to a larger extent, the fact that I grew up in the town of Norwich, Connecticut, which housed the largest state facility for the mentally ill in the state. I remember when I was a kid riding in the back of my parents' station wagon, and sometimes we would ride by the campus. It had been, back at the turn of the century, a very sort of progressive place. The philosophy was get people plugged back into the world through activity and all that kind of stuff. So there was a theater there was a baseball field, there was a tannery and so forth. It was really, they wanted people to get out of those beds and engage. By the time that I was a kid in the late 50s, early 60s, and I would ride by that place, it was sort of shrouded in mystery. It's a huge campus. There were many, many buildings there. We would drive by and there'd be a couple of people on the lawn or something. And I would say, to myself, I'd say, there's a couple of crazy people. So it was mysterious and it was kind of scary to me, but also, even as a kid, I was fascinated with who has to go there and why. Didn't know anything about my grandfather being there at the time. Then when I went away to college, I didn't go far. I went to the University of Connecticut. People used to say to me, "Oh yeah, Norwich. When I was acting crazy, my mother would threaten to bring me to Norwich." And that's both the name of the town and the hospital. So I didn't realize how much influence that had on me to be raised in that town with that facility there.
I know this much is true. It's approximately about 900 pages, which is an epic family saga, right? And the average fiction piece is anywhere between 300 to 400 pages. I had read that in 2014, you were able to get the film rights back because studios were unable to make a movie that did justice, which I'm sure in hindsight, you're grateful for, because with limited series, they can really flesh out all of the different storylines, literally 3 times as much, right? I want to say that, there's definitely differences, and I don't want to give anything away. I'll say that your book was much more sexual. Like the scenes felt more sexual.
I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, and not everything is covered, obviously, right? And there's some changes. As an executive producer, were you asked about those changes, and how do you feel about how it turned out?
I feel thrilled. I mean, I've seen it now a couple of times. I love what they've done to it. I'll take you back to the beginning, and that was in January of 2015 when my agent said to me, you get the rights back because they didn't make the film in 15 years, and it's in your contract that the rights revert back to you. And I said, "Oh, well, that's cool." I don't think I ever read the contract, so this was a nice surprise to me. She said, my agent Cassie said, "Who would be your first choice to play the twins?" And I said, "That's easy, Mark Ruffalo."
Good choice.
Had a contact. Thank you. She had a contact through her agency, and so he was filming in Europe at the time. She sent him the book. And about a week later, I got this unbelievable email from Mark. He was apologizing because he's a slow reader. He's only gotten through half of it, but he really wants to do this, and he thinks he can get it made as a series. Lucky me, just as the thing reverts back to me, along come these, sort of premiere series like from HBO and other venues. Mark and I interviewed a number of directors, and he became a friend and a really easy collaborator. We interviewed Derek Cianfrance. I liked him immediately. More importantly, I loved his movies, particularly Blue Valentine and The Place Beyond the Pines. He said to me when he signed on to do this and HBO greenlit it, he said to me, Wally, he said, I'm going to make changes and so forth, but I'm going to honor your story because that's important to me. And I said to him, yeah, okay, that's nice. I really appreciate that, but don't forget to make it your own. Don't be a slave to what's between the covers, because I know they're two very different media. I wanted him to have that freedom from me to sort of create his own. I didn't want to read the scripts as he was writing them. He was a screenwriter for each episode, and I just wanted to let him know that I trusted him. And I was not disappointed when I saw the results. I think we both got what we wanted. He took the freedom to change it here and there, but primarily it is the same story, and it honors my work.
It really does. It's really masterful. It's like two masters coming together and we'll throw Mark in there too.
His performances are unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. Honestly, I think that he is going to get all of those acting awards. I really do. I don't know if you can speak on Mark's behalf, but I had read that he really related to the brothers because he lost his brother. Mm-hmm. Do you know how he passed away? Do you know what the situation was?
That first time that we met at a little restaurant for lunch in Lower Manhattan, he talked about the connection to the subject of mental illness as applied to his family. And his brother, I think, as Thomas is dependent on Dominic, from what I could understand, I think his brother was sort of dependent on Mark. I mean, Mark was the shining star, and his brother had some emotional troubles, and I believe there were drug troubles too. And ultimately, he, you'd have to Google this, I guess, but I think the brother's death at an early age was considered to be homicide, but it had to do with the drug sale or something. I'm not positive of that.
Well, and that personal kind of experience in some ways comes out through his acting because it feels so personal. I am going to shift gears here. And I mentioned this already that I used to teach elementary school. I've taught every kindergarten through sixth grade. I've been the school librarian, and I know you're a teacher.
My wife is a retired teacher.
Oh, your wife is too.
And two of my kids.
And your kids, I love it. So I actually wrote an essay, and I'm a new writer. I very relatively new writer. And it all stemmed from when I found my grandfather's manuscript. But I actually wrote an essay about how I think writing is more exhausting than teaching kindergarten. And I know that you've taught at UConn, and for the last 20 years, you facilitate a writing program for incarcerated women. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, does your teaching help inform your writing?
Yes, actually it goes both ways too.
Right, yeah.
My teaching informed my writing. I think back to when I was a high school teacher, I think I had been teaching for about 9 or 10 years when I sort of was drawn to write a couple of short stories. And then I went off to do a Master of Fine Arts program. It was a low residency program, which means that you can have a real life. Our kids were young back then, and we didn't have a whole lot of money, but you could do this program being low residency. You went for 2 weeks, a semester, during your vacation time, and then you wrote and received criticism through the mail. So I did that, and once I had become a bona fide fiction writer myself, I threw out everything I thought I knew about how to teach writing to my students. And what I began to do instead was, instead of assigning them subject matter, I invited them to write about the things that they wanted or needed to write about. Now, because they're adolescents, the thing that they want to write about is themselves usually. I was sort of on the receiving end in a way that I hadn't been before. A lot of confessional writing, particularly by the young women. That taught me how to teach better and more effectively. Because if your students are writing about stuff that they care about, whether it's autobiographical stuff, or some kids went pretty deep into their family secrets, that kind of stuff. That's what kind of taught me how to be a better writer. And when I went to the prison, which I thought I was going to do for one time, it was right after the 2 Oprah picks. And I was scratching my head and going, gee, there are so many better writers than I am. why did this happen to me? And I couldn't answer that question. So I decided that, I just wanted to give back to the universe because the universe had been so good to me. I got a call from a woman who was the librarian at the prison. And she and I had known each other since we were kids. She said, we're in trouble here. There have been 2 or 3 suicides. There have been other attempts. They're really putting the screws to the women. We're just reaching out to anybody we know to come in and sort of distract them by talking about their work. And I hemmed and hawed. I didn't really want to do it, but I one of my many character flaws is that I have an inability to say no to people. So I said I would, and I went there for what I thought was going to be a 90-minute class, and they just, they captivated me. They were glad that I had come, and also there was no BS. They were curious about writing their own. They were also very curious about Oprah. That was sort of, during the Q&A. Oprah, yeah. But one of them, like I said, I thought I was going one time, and then the scariest looking woman in the class said, "Thanks for coming." And I said, "Oh, you're welcome." And she said, "Are you coming back?" And I think because I'm such a wimp, I didn't want to get her mad. I said, "Okay, I'll come back in 2 weeks." I said, "You guys write something, a couple of pages minimum. I don't care what you write about, and we'll have a workshop." And that's what happened. That's how it all started. And the women, it was interesting because, here I am in a class of primarily women of color who have had, some terrible things done to them and have done some terrible things. And along comes this middle-aged white guy, what does he want? And all I wanted was to be able to react to whatever they wrote. So as they began to trust me, you could see it happening. It was visually, you could see when they began to sort of jump off the diving board and write about things like how their grandfather had incested them, that kind of thing. So their writing taught me a lot about crime and punishment and what a complicated equation all of that is, and how people who have done bad things are not necessarily bad people. So the teaching and the writing have been symbiotic, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and those themes are very prevalent, and I know this much is true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With my third novel, The Hour I First Believed, I was really into the teaching at the prison, and I was writing that novel, and I thought there were 2 separate and parallel activities. But then over the years, they began to sort of crisscross. And so, some prison stuff in that novel. I got very interested in the history of that women's prison in Connecticut and so forth. So I love it when things that you think are separate begin feeding each other.
And I'm sure many of the women that end up in the prison may have had to deal with some mental health issues. And what you're doing is you're helping them kind of share their dark secrets or kind of find themselves and give a voice to themselves. And that is therapeutic. And that's amazing. The mental illness, nature versus nurture debate, it continues to this day, even during this, genetic age where we've mapped the genome. And I know this much is true. The twins, their stepfather, Ray, blames Connie, right, on being too easy on Thomas. She's too soft with him. She didn't toughen him up. Ray blames it on nurture and parenting. Dominic says, no, it's genetic. He mentions biochemistry. And yet he also kind of blames it on the triggering point, potentially on Ray. We know that there are things that can trigger mental illness. What I loved is how you used identical twins to bring this idea up. Had you thought about that before, or you look back and you go, "Wow, that worked"?
Yeah, I never think any of my novels quite work as well as I wish they did. No, when I started that novel, and it was a tough start too, I had Dominic's voice first, and I didn't know anything about his life. I knew that he was angry. The very first scene that I wrote ends up in chapter, 15 or 16, where he's driving his pickup truck, and it's the middle of the night. He can't sleep, so he goes out on the road, and he begins to doze, and the car, the truck weaves back and forth and then goes over an embankment. At that point, I didn't know he had a brother, not a twin or any other brother. But when I started figuring out who his family was, I started writing a brotherhood. And I realized that brother, there was something wrong with him. At the time, the Norwich State Hospital was closing. This was in the late 80s, early 90s. And so I got a tour, and it was the first time I had walked on the grounds there. I buttonholed a psychiatrist who I met while I was getting my tour. And I said, hey, doc, I've got this character, and he's saying this. I'm talking about, the character who became Thomas Birdsey. I said, he's saying this, he's doing this, he's believing this. And he said, I said, give me a diagnosis. And he said, I would say probably that is paranoid schizophrenia rather than, I think he was calling it true schizophrenia. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, well, that means that the paranoid schizophrenic is trying to make sense of all this stuff that's going on in his head. And so very often he creates a sort of a hero story where he is the noble hero at fighting off demons and so forth. So now I had my diagnosis. We don't have schizophrenia in our family, thank God. But now it was incumbent on me, if I was going to write about somebody who suffers from this disease, I had better do my homework. So I began reading articles and books about paranoid schizophrenia. And the best research I did was talking to people who have family members with the disease, talking with psychiatric nurses and that kind of thing. And that's how I got my education.
Let's just quickly talk about the identical twins, with Thomas and Dominic Birdsey. They were New Year's babies, and they were born December 31st, 1949 and January 1st, 1950. So not just different days or months, or years, but decades. I love how Dr. Patel, by the way, great character, the sage psychologist, she tells Dominic that his twin is his mirror image, and in scientific terms, his control group. All those images of Dominic being the rascally spider monkey and with hot Sicilian blood, and Dominic is named after his grandfather, Domenico, I don't know how to pronounce it. Domenico, sorry. Yeah. And Thomas is this gentle bunny, and he's nonviolent, and he's a anti-war thinker. But as we know, the duality of this two-headed coin is not ever really what it seems. So for example, you can be brave and scared at the same time, for example. So And you've kind of answered this already, but when you were portraying the darkness of schizophrenia, was that when the idea of using twins came out? Because it's just, to me, it's such a masterful idea, because it shows how, they're identical twins. They share the same parents, the same DNA, and yet one thing can make somebody suffer this mental health issue.
All I had at first was that this character I named Dominic was angry. And then I started writing the Brotherhood, and then all of a sudden it dawned on me that they were identical twins, and that meant that they had started out as a single fertilized egg that, for reasons we don't know, biological reasons, split in half and became two people. What I discovered was that underneath Dominic's anger is his fear. He is afraid that if they're really mirror images of each other, maybe the disease is coming to get him too. And so Dominic is sort of stuck in this dual role. He is assigned the role of his brother's keeper, and he makes a promise to his dying mother that he will remain in that role. But on the other hand, because of his fear, he is also playing survival of the fittest. He doesn't want to be the twin with this disease, and so he's playing defense. They're conflicting roles for Dominic. Now, as far as the nature-nurture thing, I did a talk, it wasn't a TED Talk, but it was sort of set up like that. One of the speakers at this weekend event that we went to, he was a biochemist whose specialty was twins, identical twins, and particularly the situation where one develops the disease and one does not. And I remember being in the breakfast line with him the second day and I said, on the nature nurture thing, what do you think? And he said, oh, we've sort of given up on that one or the other thing. He said, there are so many complicated things that go into this. Nature and nurture really are intertwined, and separating them out is not such a worthwhile kind of endeavor. When I finished that novel, I had not made any decision about whether I was writing a book about nature or nurture in terms of the twins, because my belief became you can't really know. So I left that sort of ambiguous as far as
the goddess Shiva,
where to put the blame for.
The goddess Shiva, was that the goddess that they refer to as like masculine and feminine, and that brings up that duality too, that like within us we have that roundness that you talk about, which is just beautiful.
And she is the goddess of destruction for the purpose of construction. You break something down before you build it up, and that plays right into Dominic's therapy with Dr. Patel, because she has to sort of work with him and get him to destroy some of his defensiveness and some of his anger and help him rebuild a happier life.
Which is very much what the book is about. In many of the scenes, they take place in hospitals, whether they're a general hospital when Dominic falls and he is able to walk out on crutches, or Ray has major surgery and he's able to walk out and get rehabilitated. And then we see babies being born. So in these general hospitals, there's that room for recovery. Whereas in the mental hospital, it is not necessarily the case. And it's this kind of like dark, omnipresent thing that you do not in all costs want to end up in. And I'm just wondering, do the hospital buildings have like any symbolic meaning to you? And when you write, do locations and buildings, are they characters for you?
This is Monday morning quarterbacking for me. I think in retrospect, what was happening in my own life at that time in terms of regular hospitals was that my parents were aging and becoming infirm. My mother had had a series of strokes and had become senile. And my father was, mentally fine, but he had developed in his later years Parkinson's disease. So one of them was having a deteriorating mind and the other was having a deteriorating body. And they required a lot of help and sacrifice from me. And so I spent a lot of time in hospitals. When my mother would have another TIA or something like that, I would be there for her. And also, I mentioned that my mother was one of 11 kids. So my aunts and uncles were all kind of wearing out. And, there were many visits to hospitals for them too. So I think, I wasn't at the time thinking about that. But when I look back, I think that was probably where all that hospital stuff came from.
It's really interesting how like your personal life seeps through into your writing. And I know this much is true. It's a story within a story. And Dominic gets his grandfather's manuscript, which kind of turns out to be a confession. The manuscript shows the readers in so many ways how generational trauma can get passed down, and dark family secrets, they're not always discussed, and how they can be dangerous. And Dr. Patel, of course, the sage psychologist, she encourages Dominic to finish reading the story, even though he doesn't want to. And she says, you will find wisdom from it. Why do all sins have long shadows? What does that mean?
That's a great way of putting it. We are influenced and nurtured in the way that our parents were nurtured by our grandparents and, all the way back. That's kind of what I was going for. But I didn't know I was going for that when I was writing it. At the time, I started writing the story within the story during a summer break. I was in a library that was closed for the summer. I write with loose leaf and big pens, and the pen was like flying across the pages. And it hasn't happened before or since, but that was the way the grandfather's story came out. And then when I was through with about, I had about maybe 90 pages of that handwritten, I'm like, I had no idea whether or how or if that fit into the story proper that I had several years been working on. And then I realized little by little that not only did it fit, but it was the beating heart of the story, because the dead are talking to Dominic, the dead meaning his grandfather. And it is a cautionary tale because he sees what a miserable life the grandfather had and how miserable and cruel he was to others. It's cautionary because Dominic, he had better not turn into the grandfather or he's going to have the fate of the grandfather. That became, for me, the important meaning of the grandfather's story. Dominic has to learn humility. He has to be not so arrogant as he was. His arrogance and his sort of control was what ruined his first marriage. And his arrogant control in some ways made Thomas suffer. Even though he was good to his brother, he was also making sure that he was dominant. I think the lesson that Dominic has to learn by the end of the story. And it's his grandfather with that, that confessional diary. Well, it's sort of like confessional, but it's also like a many-page excuse that he's making. I'm a great man, and that kind of thing. And the grandfather, he never gets it before the end of his life, and Dominic has to get it if he's going to save himself.
Everything you said, I saw, so that's amazing. And in the series as well, in the limited series, they did a great job with that as well. All right, last question before I ask you just the two small questions I ask all my guests.
Okay.
I love
and
how.
Rachel,
Yes.
Can I just say before you give your last question that this has been a great interview. Your questions have been really good. I can tell that you are a fellow writer, and I've had a lot of fun hanging out with you for an hour. So.
Oh, you can see my smile. It's so big. I'm so honored. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sure.
So I love how you show the complexity of life and of family and of love. So, for example, the quote unquote evil stepfather, Ray, and angry Dominic's relationship, it really shows us how complicated family is, right? Family is not always like rainbows and butterflies. And the saying, water under the bridge, is such a good saying for Three Rivers and on so many levels. And I know that so much of I know this much is true is about forgiveness and about letting go of grudges. And as you said, from destruction comes renovation. I would love to know why it's such a powerful message, forgiveness, when it comes to family, whether it's blood related, right? Because we see that family is not always blood related. We can love people that don't come from our heritage. It could be somebody that we adopt. But why is forgiveness so powerful when it comes to family?
I think maybe this has to do with my working with people who are incarcerated. I think if you are not able to forgive, you are in a kind of prison yourself, that you are the jailer of the person you can't forgive, but also you are in jail. If you can manage forgiveness, if you can articulate forgiveness and mean it, I think that frees you. That's part of the message of the book. When the story ends, the novel ends, Dominic, he's not going to go into a happily ever after life for sure. For him, being able to forgive himself and his stepfather allows him hope.
It's so true. It is. It's so freeing. Had I not forgiven my family members and myself, I would not be in the situation I am now, which I'm so grateful for. So that you explained it perfectly. All right, last two questions. If you could write your younger 20-year-old self, so when you were 20, you were probably at University of Connecticut, right? And so if you could write your younger 20-year-old self a Dear Wally love letter, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give yourself?
Interesting question. I would say I was raised during the Vietnam War, and I came of age during the Vietnam War and also, the civil rights battles and so forth. I would say keep stoking the fires of your political reactions to things. Keep fighting the bullies, keep resisting the immoral use of power, and learn to love yourself better. Stop being so shy. Be more social. Get out there and enjoy your life.
Great advice. I'm sure you would tell your kids that. Is there anything that you do that brings you happiness?
Probably the most joy I get from life is hanging out with my grandkids, being silly with them. I'm in some ways mature and in some ways not. So I like playing with the kids and being goofy and that kind of thing. We haven't been down south for about 3 months now, and I miss the kids. And as we said before, that it's not the same. Skype and Zoom and everything are great, but they're not the same.
Oh, well, I know. I can only imagine. I hope one day when I'm a grandma, I will get to experience that joy that grandparents say. That it's like the best of both worlds, right?
Yeah, and I'm sure you will.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so.
You got a big heart, I know. So you're gonna love that.
So do you. So do you. And I will have in the show note links to your website and to the HBO limited series. I just, again, want to express my sincere gratitude to speak to you today. I am truly honored, and I am blown away by your talent and look forward to reading your next book.
And Rachel, as we say here in Eastern Connecticut, I had a wicked good time talking.
Oh, awesome. I love that. Thank you for that. That's a compliment. Yeah. All right. You take care and best of luck.
Okay. You too. How about now?
Bye, Wally. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
This is Rachel Steinman. For more information or to contact me with any questions, comments, or guest ideas, please check out rightnowrachel.com. That's right with a W. Thank you so much for listening, subscribing, and sharing, dear family. And if you found value in what you've just heard, I would love and so appreciate a great review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, I wish you love, happiness, and good mental health.